She, her, Director of the National Partnership for New Americans. This morning, we have an incredible program for you. We have some special announcements to respond to our colleagues' action yesterday. So we want to announce thank you. Can I hear a little bit more applause for being responsive in real time to our colleagues' demand that we stand in solidarity? We have a change today in today's programming. So there is a session in Ballroom D that's going to come across your conference app. It's called Black Trans Migrant Justice, a conversation on detention and global anti-Blackness. All of you are invited to join today from 2 to 3:15 Ballroom D. And here joining me on stage are other board members from NPNA and also organizations that help plan the NIC each year. Angelica Salas.
In addition to that, what we will be speaking on the change in the plenary. Ken, our fellow board member, will add to that. We were also one of the requests was that the visibility of the Black immigrant bail fund be promoted by NPNA and by the NIC, and so you will be receiving information via the app. And we encourage you to donate to the bail immigrant, the Black immigrant bail fund, and you'll get more information. In addition to that, we will also provide you a link by which you can donate to BAJI, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration.
Good morning, everybody. In addition to Solidarity and Focus plenary at 11:15, we will be adding my board member from Michigan United, the founder of the African Bureau of Immigration and Social Services, Sadie Sarr.
This is just the start of having the many critical conversations that the immigrant advocacy community needs to have. So we thank you for bringing that to light and for your courage yesterday to bring together that action.
And now it is my distinct pleasure to announce your MC for today, Arun Venugopal from National Public Radio. He is a nationally known radio host who reports on current issues, racial justice, and he will be your MC for today. Please give it up for Arun Venugopal.
Hey people, how are you? Kind of quiet, lukewarm? Oh, come on, please give me a little better than that, come on. Welcome to Nick and welcome to Tuesday. This could be the day that you meet Barry Manilow somewhere in the hallways of this hotel. Gen Z is like, what's a Barry Manilow? Millennials are like, what's a Barry Manilow? My name is, as Nicole graciously announced, my name is Arun Venugopal, and I'm a host and senior reporter in the Race and Justice Unit at WNYC, aka NPR New York. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so grateful to be here. Grateful to be among you. Grateful to be among the people who are apparently saving our democracy time and time again. Nice job, you guys. In a few minutes, I'm going to be joining our panelists who are here on stage for our morning plenary. Hear our story, Asian and Pacific Islander communities rising. But first, I thought I'd spend a few minutes just talking about what I do and who I'm from, which is, say, public radio and our relationship to this fragile democracy of ours in this age of insurrections. Now, as I said, I'm with NPR. Technically, I don't work for NPR. I work for WNYC. It's all one big swirl for most people, so we'll leave it at that. NPR is obviously one of those very loaded ideas and spaces, and it's an acronym that signifies vastly different things to a lot of different people across the political spectrum. If you happen to go on this website, which I only recently encountered, it's called the acronym Attic. You'll find that the kinds of things it means are they're interesting, they're illuminating. Technically, yes, it is National Public Radio, but that's just the literal meaning. If you go on the site, maybe you go on for other reasons because you're aging and you're like, what does LMFAO actually mean? And TTYL and LOL and all those things that the youth use these days. But if you look up NPR, you'll see that for certain listeners, for angry listeners, it stands for National Public, not National Public Radio, but more like National Petroleum Radio. For certain people, it's National Pentagon Radio. The site actually has this note that says this definition appears somewhat frequently. For people coming from a different place on the political spectrum, it's known as National Palestinian Radio, very menacing. I'm sure some of the people in this room are like, no, we listen to NPR. It's not exactly National Palestinian Radio. But my point isn't so much that people like to complain about news organizations and their alleged political slant. For a lot of people in the industry, their response to these kinds of allegations, this name calling, is more like, oh, great, bring it on. You know, we're getting hit from the right, we're getting hit from the left. That means we're doing our job right. This is sort of a convention in the industry. And almost always, it's the wrong way to look at this kind of criticism. I'll get back to that in a second. What I think is more interesting is what's happening within news organizations, such as mine, and within the news industry in general. For a long time, we've had this construct, a couple constructs really, about the news, especially in the mainstream news media. And one of those is this assumption of objectivity, which I know you're all very familiar with, this sort of selective emotional distancing that we have from the events happening in our society. There's also the assumption of balance, which is to say a very specific balance, right? The balance between liberal and conservative. We're told that this balance is a sign of good journalism, and so too in criticism, such as what I described, is also a good thing. If you're getting hit from the left and the right, you're doing your job well. This is, of course, a false construct because the real choice isn't between liberal and conservative. The choice is between pluralism and white supremacy, between the fulfillment of a multiracial democracy and the rejection of it. And that's something that the industry, I think, is only starting to actually understand. Journalism is struggling to kind of come to grips with what is happening before our eyes. It doesn't quite know how to make the leap from the conventions that we've practiced for many, many years and to this new post-MAGA reality that we've seen for the last 4 or 5 years. But we do see a couple concessions happening in certain places, and I'll mention a couple. In my own organization, we recently created a race and justice unit. It happened, actually, the formation of this happened immediately after the Black Lives Matter protests last year. So you see a direct connection between what is happening on the street, what is happening, what is the kind of movements that you're seeing organized, deployed, and how news organizations are adjusting and conceding to that display of power. So I think it's worth acknowledging that these changes are happening. Although we created this unit soon after the formation, the actual thinking process was a little longer than that. It started after many of us were sent to the National Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. Anybody been there? See a few hands. It's, of course, an incredibly powerful experience. I highly recommend you go there. This is where me and many of my colleagues were confronted with these words by Toni Morrison. Some of you may be familiar with it from Beloved. More than eyes or feet, more than lungs that have yet to draw free air, more than your life-holding womb and your life-giving private parts, hear me now, love your heart, for this is the prize. This summer, a fairly significant change also happened at NPR, and specifically in regards to its ethics guidelines. The old guidelines had placed a blanket ban on any participation in marches, rallies, and public events. And this is something I can speak from personal experience. It's something we take seriously because you don't want to lose your job. You're worried and you think it's a good practice. Sometimes you don't, but you're very guarded about these kinds of things. And especially in the age of social media, people don't take those chances for the most part. And many of us do adhere to these principles. The new NPR policy, however, reads, NPR editorial staff may express support for democratic civic values that are core to NPR's work, such as, but not limited to, the freedom and dignity of human beings, the rights of a free and independent press, the right to thrive in society without facing discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual identity, disability, or religion. Now, I don't know exactly what led to these revisions, and I don't know to what extent people are going to go out and participate in protests. It's probably too soon to tell. But I would venture that the news business now has enough Black and brown journalists to present a challenge to long-standing liberal platitudes about journalism, the kinds of conventions I talked about earlier. The more important story, I think, is to be found in the text itself, what I just read. NPR staff were told they can express support for the freedom and dignity of human beings and for the rights of a free and independent press. In the last few years, what I think is that it's become clear to industry leaders that these things are actually intertwined. For too long, we've allowed ourselves to think we can operate at a remove from the society in which we live. Perhaps because for so long, our industry was so overwhelmingly white and male. But now we're faced with loss of our democracy. This is not something that sounds hyperbolic anymore, at least not in the newsrooms and in the news networks in which I move. Black lives, Indigenous lives, immigrant lives, they are not the only things at stake. This is increasingly apparent to people, I think, in the industry. Our ability to understand and document and disseminate the truth is also at risk. Consider it an act of self-preservation then. And one suspects a harsh lesson in the reality of American exceptionalism. I'll leave it at that. On that note, let's proceed with our morning plenary. Hear our story, Asian and Pacific Islander communities rising. So let me go ahead and introduce each of our panelists. Okay, let's see. So, and excuse me, well, we have also one person who is on screen. Is Quinn here? Oh, there she is right in front of us. Can everybody see her there? Okay, great. Hi, Quinn. This is Quinn Din. She's Executive Director of the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center, CIRAC. Please give her a hand. We also have Tavai Samuelu, Executive Director of Empowering Pacific Islander Communities. We have, on the far left, Joanne Yu, Executive Director of the Asian American Federation. We have next to her, Christine Chen, Executive Director of Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote, APIA Vote. And we have Shuming Cheer, Deputy Director of Programs and Campaigns at California Immigrant Policy Center. And next to me, we have Sung-Young Choi Moro, Executive Director of National Asian Pacific Women's Forum. All right, so we have a lot to cover, especially given that for a lot of people in our Asian American communities, they've been dealing not just with one pandemic, but an additional pandemic, a pandemic of violence and exclusion. And I want to talk about these things. I want to talk about how our communities are responding to this in the last year and a half or so, especially. But before I talk about that, I think it's important to sort of get at some of just on a personal level. I want to understand how people have been sort of navigating as organizers, as leaders of communities, but also just as individuals, as people, how you all have been dealing with this pandemic and organizing out of your living rooms, your bedrooms. So, Tavai, let me just quote from your bio. You said something, during the pandemic, she has learned that her most important title is Anti-AAPI. What does this mean? Yeah.
It means that I spend most of my waking hours as the executive director of EPIC, and during the pandemic, I've been doing everything from my kitchen table and my parents' dining room, where the Wi-Fi is best, and I've been doing it in the full view of my 5 nieces and nephews. The youngest is 4, Lavani. Oh God. It's just been one of those things where it's so easy to forget as you're clicking through your 12th hour of Zoom meetings why you do this. And to watch this 4-year-old who has such a command of herself and has the best boundaries I've ever seen, and will immediately, when she hears me talking in a meeting, be very quick to pop up on camera and tell everyone, this is my Anti-AAPI. It's lunchtime. Anti-AAPI. We need to go watch like Odd Buds, Anti-AAPI. And so it's this really beautiful thing of being like, anybody can call me whatever they want, but at the end of the day, I am Anti-AAPI. It's the best title I have. It's the one that I'm proudest of. It's also the most humanizing.
Yeah. Did you want anything, Sung-Young, to that?
Sure. I mean, I'm a working mom of a kid who started kindergarten on Zoom. And I think many of us probably feel this way, that living in this country has been a huge challenge for working parents, especially working moms. And I think that coupled with, my daughter and I've had 2 incidences happen on our walk in our old neighborhood in Chicago where people yelled at us and one person threw rocks at us, and it really scared her. And then, and my daughter is Korean and Black. And then the summer with all the uprising, one of the things we realized is that she was having a lot of anxiety because she was afraid either I was gonna get killed or her dad was gonna get killed. this has been the reality for many families of color. And, you know, like just the basics of like trying to juggle a kindergartner learning on Zoom and working. I think just the things that have happened in this country that has been, years in the making, but that has really bubbled over this last year has really shaped who my daughter is, and I don't like it.
Do you use your work to help explain the nature of what your daughter and you all are hearing, what's being shouted at on the street?
Yeah, I think, you know, so when the Atlanta shootings happened, NAPOF really took on the role of making sure that the narrative about why the spa shootings happened was correct. There was a quick jump to say that it was related to the COVID, you know, anti-Asian hate, but if you think about it carefully, it's actually much more deeply rooted and much more commonly experienced by Asian American women, which is hypersexualization of us and violence against women of color in this country. And so when I was on the news all the time, I think she made the connection, like, oh, this is why mommy does what mommy, and you know, doing this work, like your kid, they can't go to school and say your mom is a teacher or a doctor or something like simple to explain. And so she started telling her friends that my mommy talks on TV and tells people to stop being mean, right? So like, I think for her, as awful as that tragedy was, it was a way for her in her little 6-year-old brain to reconcile why I need to do what I'm doing, and that, you know, and she's much better now. She feels like, oh, okay, there are people working on this, right? All of you in this room, everybody on this panel, there are adults who care about me and won't let my mommy or daddy die, right? And so I think she's kind of come around, and you know, it's been a really beautiful way for her to understand why I do the work I do.
When you're an executive director in ED, you're the big boss, you know, you're the one who's fighting the fight out there, leading the communities. I'm just wondering, and Joanne, maybe you can, you know, start this off. Do you feel that it's in your head, at least, that you can't be vulnerable, that you can't say like, this pandemic, all this violence, everything, it's getting to me?
So first of all, I want to shout out my staff, because I think all the great work many of the New Yorkers know that whenever I'm in front of a camera and I start to think about my community and all the Asian hate crimes, I start crying. And so I think part of it is that I am just so angry for our community, right? Like, and the fact that our erasure for so many years and centuries have gotten us to this point where we are just somebody's racist, you know, like target. And I was angry I'm scared for my staff, right? I have, you know, at the Federation, it's all Asian staff. And so, you know, I'm always telling them like, you guys don't go outside, don't come to the office, right? But I was also scared for my family. Obviously, my parents are, you know, here this morning, but I was, you know, they're elderly. I was scared for them. I was scared for my friends. I was scared for myself too, because I did have incidents very early on during the lockdown. I'd go outside and, you know, I live in like this super hipster Brooklyn neighborhood. And I went out a couple times and people stood in front of me to try to intimidate me, right? And the immediate reaction as a human being, not as executive director, but as human being, is like, you do feel scared, because you think like, oh man, right? This guy's gonna punch me in the face. And because all the stores were closed, who's gonna watch out for me, right? Because I know all of the small businesses. And then few times, so I've adapted all of these weird ways of coping, right? I don't walk on the sidewalk. I don't like people walking behind me. I always turn around and check out. If I walk in the street, I look at, I don't walk on the sidewalk. I walk in the street next to the cars in New York City. And once this guy rode his bike and he realized that I was walking, he rode by and then he turned around and saw that I was an Asian woman and he came by. And I thought, you know what? Maybe this is a hill I'm gonna literally die on because I refuse to let him intimidate me, because this is what they're looking for, this fear, right? Of like me shrinking. And I'm thinking like, hell no, right? Bro, like come at me, right? Because I will shove you off your bike and you might hit me a few times, but I will shove you off your bike and I will get a few punches in too, right? And I will bring the full force of the entire Pan-Asian community in New York City to your doorstep. So, but it's what you're thinking. But as a human being, how can you not be scared? And as a human being, how can you not feel? Because in this work, you get to know the victims, right? Not just for myself, but you get to know the victims. And at some point, they become part of your extended family. And you think, oh my God, how are they going to get out of this crisis? How do I keep my sense of responsibility to my staff? How do I keep them safe? How do I keep all of our member agency staffs safe? Like it's a lot to deal with. And so I will say, ultimately, there was not a lot that I thought about for my own safety. I just thought like, just keep working really hard because then we'll figure out the solution, right? But yeah, it's been hard would be the grossest understatement of the year.
Yeah. Quinn, I want to make sure you have a chance to add to anything in case you do want to. Is there anything you want to add to that?
I think just to your last question, I mean, first of all, what an incredibly beautiful panel. I am so honored and privileged to call these colleagues my friends and my peers. And the truth is that each and every one of us have the power to rewrite what vulnerability looks like in our communities, and that vulnerability is power. That when Sung Yeon spoke
that women of color in this country have been forced to be strong, not because we want to be strong. And somehow that has become the normative and the only way to be accepted into society. And it's wrong. I don't want to be a super mom. I just want to be a regular mom. Fix the system so I can be a regular mom and not a super mom. I'm tired of that word, of how immigrants make everything out of nothing. All the stories of, oh, my dad came here with $50 in his pocket and look what we have. That's all really, really hurtful, harmful narrative, because all it does is perpetuate the racist, white supremacist system that exists and plays into this exceptional mentality that, if you work hard enough, you can get there. Well, I know a lot of immigrants, especially Black and brown immigrants, who work harder than most, white collar people in this country and will never see the kind of money that they're making, right? So resilience is not a word we want to be proud of.
Christine?
I would also say that it's also an excuse to not fund the community or not pay someone for what they're worth, and that's why they're using the word resilient. I mean, we've had to do what we had, but the reality is that we really need to make sure that AAPI community is actually seen for its diversity, its needs, and that it needs to be funded and resourced properly. I mean, I've post-Atlanta stories were finally coming out, recognizing that this community, less than half of 1% of all foundation dollars go to this community, and less than 1% of corporate dollars go to this community. And so, but it isn't also about, it's not just about resources, it's also about not being the other and always missing from the data. We need to be included as part of this narrative in every single issue, and to recognize that we're not doing this by ourselves, but we're also working in coalition and with other communities of interest and color, fighting for the same issues as well.
Shimi, anything to add? I want to make sure you have a chance to be part of this as well. Anything?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo the sentiments around, like, I don't think if given a choice, like many of our communities or we ourselves would want to be resilient. It's just the fact that over decades, over centuries, there have been so many anti-immigrant, white supremacist policies that have been lobbed at us that also extend to what happens in our home countries that really drive migration to the US. So it's been the accumulation of generations of systematic oppression that many of us have been forced to respond to in order to survive. Then it's called being resilient. But really, I think given the choice, I fully agree that we just really need to dismantle these different systems that have been harming our communities, whether it's like militarism, imperialism, white supremacy, so that we don't have to be in a position to say like, okay, we're surviving, but instead to really and not have to confront any of those systematic injustices in the first place.
I'd like to turn to history, because I think this is really an era in which we're seeing the deployment of history, sort of like a collective educational effort coming from communities, trying to tell people why we are experiencing things the way we are. And I'm wondering if there's any particular historical episodes that you use in sort of your toolkit of educational resources. Quinn, I noticed on your organization's website, there is a remarkable ad from 1978. It's an ad in the New York Times from the International Rescue Committee, and it's titled "Black Americans Urge Admission of the Indo-Chinese Refugees." I'm just wondering when exactly this was shared and why.
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, this ad resurfaced after the incidences in Minnesota and the need for our communities to really understand where we stand in Black solidarity conversations led our communities to reflect on how Black communities have always stood in solidarity for Southeast Asian American communities before this community even existed, particularly when national polling data was against the acceptance of refugee communities. And the painful part of this history is that this is a history that we have to reclaim and rewrite because it's not written anywhere in the textbooks. Lots of peers say, I don't know how, I don't know about this history.
Oh, 1 second, Christine. We lost you on volume. Could you have a problem here? Okay, 1 second. Why don't you go ahead and try, Quinn? There you go.
Just that the long legacy of solidarity is a history that we have to reclaim and rewrite all the time. It's not written for us, and it's our responsibility to really stand in that power.
Anyone else, are there certain historical episodes that you think help shape your ability to educate the public around the issues, especially around anti-Asian violence, misogyny? These are things that go back decades, centuries, really. Any particular things, Joanne?
In my presentations, I've talked a lot about Vincent Chin. I talk about, everything, Page Act, Chinese Exclusion Act, the Muslim, 9/11, right? Because everybody thinks, oh, this Asian hate, this is new. And I'm telling people, no, we've been enduring this forever. I mean, racism, to be honest, is racism is old as this country, right? It's like this country is built on racism and oppressing somebody. Our community has been enduring this for so long, but I talk about Vincent Chin a lot because I don't think people are aware that, well, first of all, none of this is taught in school, right? So like our kids don't even know, like, you know, nobody understands. And I have young cousins and nieces and nephews. And when we talk about this at our holiday table, they say, who's Vincent Chin, right? So then, you know, you have to go into the story. They all know what the stories I'm going to tell, right? But so, you know, Vincent Chin, as I understand it, was a local Detroit killing, right? It didn't become national news until when Jesse Jackson, who was running for president, brought his national media with him. And it became this national story of like, look at what is happening. And I will say in New York, some of the boldest voices standing with us has been the Black community. And, you know, like when Reverend Sharpton expects you to be in Harlem and he tells everybody, our community has endured all of this racism. And why are we like, we need to stand together with this community because the Asian community is now, you know, being victimized. And so when we know pain, we have to make sure other people don't know pain. I think that's really important. And Vincent Chin and Jesse Jackson, you know, the role that he had in creating the modern Asian American social justice movement, because that's when, you know, the national news hits and everybody's understanding what is happening. And so, you know, there were nonprofits formed all over the country, right? We still talk. And recently, I know that during Anti-Asian Hate, you know, the height of that, Reverend Jackson wrote an op-ed about, you know, his role and what he's seeing. And I think, you know, all of the really important milestones in this country have been from a point of solidarity. And I think we need to remember that. And I think I will say that, you know, oftentimes during like the frenzy of, you know, like figuring out what is happening in New York City as a city with the most number of anti-Asian hate incidents, not just the punching, but also like seniors are telling me like somebody's spitting on me, they threw me down on the sidewalk, like, but none of that got reported. But New York City has the horrific distinction of having the city with the highest number of anti-Asian incidents. We ring in at over 2,000. In all of that, you know, it's really hard to grapple, but a lot of people have come back to me, a lot of seniors have come back to me to say, so how come nobody is standing with us? Do people care from other communities? What do they think? You know, like, are people understanding? And, you know, for us, it's always, of course they care, right? When they come to, but we also had to, as an Asian American organization, organizing our community and leading, we also had to make a conscious effort, not just to have us lead and be in those conversations. We had to invite other people from other communities, because it was like, I wanted to hear the Latino community, the African American community, the Black immigrant community, the broader immigrant rights community. We needed to put them center with us, because they also needed to be shown, right? Like, they also need to be highlighted that they also were standing in solidarity and they understood our pain. And they were always we've been together and we understood all of this together. And so I think, I think what is happening now is that we're all waking up. I think there's some really important conversations being had. I know that I'm having some really important conversations with seniors, Asian seniors. And I think part of it also too with Asian American seniors is because, you know, as everybody has said, we've lived under this model minority myth, right? Like, don't talk about anything. Don't talk about anything. It's going to bring shame. Well, that's exactly what got us here in the first place, right? So now I think we're saying, no, we want to talk about it. We're really angry because when all of this started happening, nobody responded to me. I can't even tell you the number of F-bombs I dropped in front of elected officials, because I was like, people are getting the crap beat out of them walking down the street. They're going to work. They're the first, you know, responders every day at 7 o'clock. All of these well-meaning people, they're banging their pots and pans. Oh, thank you so much for going to work. Some of these people had to go to work because that's how they put food on the table, right? And so there needs to be some understanding that all of this processing about anti-Asian hate, it comes from, they're making us do the processing, right? And I'm thinking like, hell no, because we live this every day. Everybody else needs to process this. Like, we know how we feel. We know what we've been doing. Everybody else needs to sit down to figure out like, what is happening? Oh my God, right? Because the word with resiliency in all of this, Why is the onus on us? And when everybody asks me after every panel I've done, oh my God, what does the Asians want from all of, what do the Asians think that we need to fix anti-Asian hate? And I keep saying, like, well, the hell do you fix racism, right? Like, that's ultimately what it is. And why is the onus on the victim, right? Because we're just trying to survive. And so all of this is that we are having really important conversations that we needed to have, but we have been having them for a while. So it's a long answer, but I'm just, it's just been a really long year. And I feel like all we do is we keep talking, right? But at this point, I think we're at the point where we're saying, we don't want to talk anymore, we want action. We want stuff that reflects us. We want, shows, and we want conversations that also center Asian American, Asian pain, what the South Asian Muslim community went through after 9/11. We want to talk about what's happening with our Pacific Islander brothers and sisters. We are starting to make those demands, and I feel like in some ways it's like a reawakening of our voices, because we're saying, we're so sick and tired of being told to be quiet, that we're saying you cannot put the genie back in the bottle.
Shuming, I know you want to say something earlier. Joanne was referring to Vince and Chin and the ability to talk about these solidarities, interracial solidarities. Was there something that you think you've turned to?
Yeah, I was going to uplift a couple of moments. I mean, I also was going to mention the Page Act, because when you look at really how immigration policy has basically, how race, class, gender, sexuality have really been interrelated, and how immigration policy and law unfolds. And you look at the Page Act and how it was specifically aimed at banning laborers as well as women who supposedly were quote unquote immoral, and how that was used in particular against Chinese women at a moment in US history when there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment. So that's often a point that I go back to, because it's much less well known than the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And I think also it's really difficult or really hard to talk about anti-immigrant or anti-Asian policies without even looking at what has happened before Asian Americans have come to this country. So we need to really look at what is the history of militarism, of US intervention in other countries, of economic interventions that have really fueled the migration here to the US. And it's very complicated. I think, we were talking before this panel about how the six of us cannot necessarily represent the breadth and depth of the AAPI experience. The linguistic differences, the various countries of origin. There's so much rich history that it could sure take us many days to talk about it. And then besides the specific histories of our communities and of many of us individually, there's also the broader laws that have impacted communities of color here in the US. So the other law that I frequently talk about, and I think many of the people in the audience are well aware of, is the IRA from 1996. And that's also the time when we saw the war on drugs, the war on youth, just, this combination of really harmful, racist policies that fueled this push towards creating this mass deportation machine, and really pushed people of color into the detention and deportation systems, really expanded the detention and deportation systems. So I feel like we can't really talk about immigration policy without looking at that particular moment. And how these different policies that, again, intersect and harm people based on race and class have come together at those particular moments. And I'm sure there's a lot more we could excavate around 9/11 and many moments since then, but that I just wanted to uplift the 1990s as part of that piece of the puzzle in terms of explaining how do we get to this moment where detentions and deportations and the mass criminalization of Black, Brown, and Asian American communities has happened.
I remember a few months ago speaking to a Sikh friend who felt frustrated that after a number of Sikh Americans were killed in the Midwest. Was it Ohio or Pennsylvania? Indiana, sorry. He's like, why wasn't hashtag Stop Asian Hate trending then? He felt a sense of abandonment, I guess. So I guess to your point, Shuming, and to anybody else, is this an unwieldy, I know this is a perennial question, does this umbrella term of Asian American work? Is it on balance more beneficial than not? But is it an unsustainable term? given the massive diversity. Is there anybody here who thinks that it should be abandoned for some other sort of construct?
I think it's both and, right? Like, I feel like if you think about, I guess it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, is how I would answer it. If your goal is to gain more political power so that you can determine the way this country functions for all of our agency and living meaningful lives where we can thrive in, then you have to think about, like, we want to eventually get there, but what is the system we work in and how do we get there? And unfortunately, this label, they decided would lump like the largest continent in the world into one census checkbox and called us Asian Americans. And then, Pacific Islanders, that term came about later. And so to me, it's like, Asian American Pacific Islanders is going to be the largest minority group by 2050, according to Pew. We need to recognize that, and we need to know that that is political power. So what are we doing if, for those of us whose interest is in gaining political power to create structural changes, what are we doing so that we are unified, we are making sure that we can move as one and multiple at the same time, right? And I think, the term itself is, depending on who you ask, right? I remember so I'm an immigrant myself. When I first came to college, I got invited to join the Asian American student, club. I brought along with me my Indian friend, and just randomly, I spent 12 years of my life in a boarding school in India. So I was like, okay, let me bring my friend. And they were like, why did you bring him? He's not Asian. And I was like, have you looked at a map of Asia? So there's a lot that we need to unpack even within our community about what's happening and who we center in these stories, right? But also, Stop Asian Hate was trending when the women in Atlanta were murdered, and this is my soapbox, right? But and I'm like, yes, stop Asian hate, but these women were actually murdered not only because they were Asian who happened to be women, but because they were Asian American women. And very few people were talking about that, right? And so we need to, I'm sure y'all are familiar with this word, we need to normalize talking about and doing our work in an intersectional way. Right? We need to chew our gum and walk at the same time, right? We need to take the feedback that, yes, we are leaving, when all this Asian hate all this money started pouring in, I was like, well, how about the Muslim groups and the Sikh groups and the South Asian groups that have been doing this work forever and a day, who've been living under surveillance of some sort and threat of some sort, for a very, very long time, right? So I think for me, it's about expanding the table, be genuine, and when you make a mistake, apologize. No one's perfect, but I don't think we should shy away from trying to do this audacious work of building unity within our community because everyone's getting called out. I think that would be a huge missed opportunity. We are going to be the largest minority group by 2050. We need to really take stock of that. And as leaders, figure out how are we leading? How are we creating space so that we can be united and different all at the same time?
Tobias, anything you want to add to that?
My face is loud, so I didn't even say anything. I was just reacting. No, because I feel like you just started, you're like, oh, okay, let's abandon Asian American. So I'm just sitting with the rumors that you're starting right here in front of all these people. Well, I think there's a couple of things that Sing-Yeon brought up that are important and some things that I want to consider, right? There's the notion of Asian American or AAPI is not a racial category. AAPI hasn't been a racial category since 1997. So when we talk about it, it's a coalitional term, right? And coalition is intended, how do we leverage our collective power against institutions? And so I also think about, I'm from California. I also have no notions of California exceptionalism. But California has been majority minority for a while now. We're no closer to dismantling white supremacy. So it's not enough to be the largest group, right? We need to be the largest group that's committed to betraying white supremacy on a daily basis, right? And so even when we think about it, we were talking about this panel, I was like, well, this is an immigrant integration panel, and I'm very clear. The US immigrated to the Pacific. We didn't go to you, you came to us. And thinking even like the notion of Asian American Pacific Islander, the reason American isn't after Pacific Islander is because of honoring the indigeneity, but I think also about Dr. Haunani K. Trask, who yelled from the steps of Iolani Palace in 1993, 100 years after the overthrow of the monarchy, and she yelled at the top of her lungs, "We are not American. We are not American." And so thinking even about Pacific Islander, like, what is it when America happens without your consent, without your permission, and continues to happen, right? So I'm not talking about history. I'm like, we're not post-colonial. American Samoa is still a US colony. The US will run around with all of its exceptionalism talking about, I was like, Brett, you are still a colonizer. I'm sitting across from empire on a daily basis. And then in the heart of empire, having to really contend with, right, as many of the narratives around immigration, and especially in the API community, tend to get really problematic for Pacific Islanders, right, of who straddle this line between indigeneity and immigration. So battling anti-indigeneity and xenophobia, right? So I think the other aspect is, and I really love, because the other brilliance of Dr. Haunani K. Trask is how quickly she named, you don't get a Native Hawaiian sovereignty movement without Malcolm X. Many of the things as people are holding up Jacinda Ardern and Aotearoa or New Zealand, those are things that were seeded by the Polynesian Panthers who learned at the feet of Black Panthers, right? That we have never survived without Black communities. That even, I think, even, you know, as somebody who loves Proverbs, I love a proverb because as people are calling things unprecedented, I'm like, yo, Proverbs tell me my ancestors saw that shit. And because I'm here, I survived it. They survived it. But there's a Samoan like warrior's prayer where one of the lines, which means like, may your skin be dark as night. But it's talking about how when we embraced Blackness, when we understood pro-Blackness as critical to our survival, right? It's like, may you be stealth enough to cheat death. And so this is the other aspect of needing to be pro-Black, needing to have these things of like, I don't feel represented by every PI I see. Like actually most, well that's a whole other thing. But to be sitting with like, you don't represent me unless you're pro-Black and pro-Indigenous, right? You don't represent me unless you are anti-empire, right? It's not enough that we share a racial identity. You also need to be pushing with whatever political power or will that you've created to make sure that we are creating systems for freedom. I was like, I don't know who the communications director for white supremacy was, but they were super effective. They did a super good job at globalizing white supremacy, right? And so sitting with it and thinking about like, maybe the most effective project of colonization is how quickly it helped us forget freedom. Right? And so when we're sitting here in these rooms, getting very cerebral about the daily cost of this, there's also an aspect of like, I don't want to keep producing experts in oppression, people who are super articulate about naming struggle, but struggle to envision liberation, can't remember freedom. And so, you know, I think that's the part of it, right? Where I'm sitting there thinking like, epigenetics is cool, but I also know liberation is my motherfucking DNA. Like, I'm not that far removed from my own freedom.
Christine, I want to talk about the vote real quick. According to the Brennan Center, there between January 1st and July 14th of this year, at least 18 states enacted 30 laws that restrict access to the vote. At the same time, there's more than 400 bills with provisions that restrict voting access in almost pretty much every state in the 2021 legislative sessions. How restrictive are these voting measures in terms of their impact on AAPI communities?
Well, it's not even AAPI community. It's all voters. And what I think many of us in the voting rights advocacy world is trying to tell all of our friends in the advocacy community is that if you're fighting for immigration, healthcare, education, whatever the issue is, you need to couple that with fighting for voting rights. Because what they're doing right now, they are trying to continue to dismantle at the state level, at the federal level, and also impacting our redistricting efforts, which will impact us for 10 years. And what they're trying to do ultimately is, as they see this population growth within the immigrant community, within the Asian American community, they are fearful, and that's why they're utilizing these tactics. So for example, a lot of the legislation, they're trying to cut back on mail-in ballots, early voting opportunities. For the Asian American Pacific Islander community, 3 out of 4 voters from our electorate voted early. And the reason we saw the largest increase out of any racial group in terms of turning out and registration was because we had access to early voting and mail-in. And we also even saw this when California, Oregon, and Washington, who typically vote by mail, Asian American Pacific Islander voters always over-index in terms of utilizing those opportunities. At the same time, also, they're trying to enforce and actually instill voter ID laws. Well, we know that if you look like an immigrant, then they're going to go ahead, or if you're of color, they're going to go and ask you for more ID. You're going to be like targeted and actually, questioned more in terms of whether or not you have the right to vote, right? And so these are things that are happening not only at the federal level with, right now, we're trying to make sure that on the Senate side in the next week or two, that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act gets passed, but also at the local level. We have to pay attention. And then also I want to reemphasize, especially with this community here as immigrant advocates, is that if you look at the census numbers and we see the shifting of political power because of the population shift, right? We saw that congressional districts from California, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania are shifting to other locations. But the reality is the immigrant communities are still growing in all 50 states. For the AAPI community, in the last 10 years, we grew in double digits in every single state except for Hawaii, where we're already a majority, right? But so what that means to me is that, well, we're growing in these locations. We're also becoming more diverse because I know in the AAPI community, we have to pay attention that the Bhutanese, the Nepalese community is growing, and so that means creating space, making sure that we tell those who are redrawing the lines that where are these new communities growing and living? What is their stories? So that way it gets taken in consideration when we're looking at redrawing the lines and figuring out what communities are going to have power for the next 10 years.
I want to we have about 5 minutes left, and I just want to return to the point about Atlanta, which for many people was really many Americans who were not paying attention. This is in March of this year. It's really when they start realizing, oh, maybe there's a problem with anti-Asian violence, right? But we also saw this sort of trend amongst opinion writers who insisted, well, maybe these weren't racialized incidents. After all, the shooter said that he wasn't going after Asian women. And so I guess my question is, and maybe Sung-Hyun, maybe you have some thoughts?
You gave me 5 minutes. I'm just kidding. I won't talk
90 seconds. But I guess the question is simply the takeaway from this that, like, yet again, white guys get the last word, even if they're alleged murderers, or is it something more complex than that?
So that's so funny. So you fit right into your profession, because every single reporter I talked to, the 3 days post Atlanta shooting, asked me that question, right?
Yeah, great.
And
Just special.
So, well, you do it 9 months later, so you're keeping the conversation going. And what I said is, the problem is you don't understand systemic racism and misogyny. That is the problem, right? That he himself may think that it had nothing to do with their race, but as Ximing mentioned and others mentioned about the Page Act and other laws that have been passed, and militarism, Asian American women experience hypersexualization in this country in a way that I didn't realize most people didn't know. So one of the things that I got told the most, and it's like seared in my memory for life, is the number of reporters, mostly men and not Asian American women, but other reporters who said to me, I would talk about my personal experience of street harassment, right? Oh, where are you? Are you Korean? Oh yeah, I served on this military base. Do you know this area? And it always devolves into, well, you remind me of my girlfriend, and then says something really inappropriate. In, more, supposedly respectable settings, they're hitting on me saying like, I fell in love Korean women when I was in the military, right? Like all this stuff, right? And the number of people that apologize to me that I'm so sorry this happens, and I cannot believe this happens to so many of you and nobody that we didn't know, right? And as so many Asian American women came out and started talking about our own stories, right? That the thing that really shook all of us is that because many of us have been in situations where that could have happened. And there are many Asian American women who have been murdered because of hypersexualization that did not make the news the way mass shootings do in this country. And I will guarantee you there are plenty that have been in danger, harmed, murdered since, and will be in the future, right? And so we need to get our story straight about what is happening. And it is a broader story of what happens with commodification, objectification, and hypersexualization of women of color in this country. I don't know how many of you heard the story in Wyoming about this white girl that went missing from Florida. It was all over the national news. Do you know how many indigenous women go missing in that state? Right? This is the problem. So this is the bigger issue, is that when we talk about women, we want to center whiteness. When we talk about people of color, women are completely erased. And so we need to find a way to center the stories of women of color and make sure that it's not, just because he said it wasn't about race, that it's not about race. But also the other thing that got me was, then everybody jumped on it and said, of course it's about race because it's COVID. And I'm like, no, that's not why it's about race. It's about race because of the Page Act, 1850 Page Act. It's about race because of militarization of Korea, Okinawa, Philippines, and other Pacific countries in the Pacific Rim, in the interest of U.S. Security, right? These are the reasons why when most men look at me when I walk down the street, they look at me as a sex worker or a prostitute or somebody that they should have. Because of these experiences, so many of the men in this country go over to Asia and that's what results in all of this. That's why it was an act of racialized sexual violence, not just sexual violence.
And I would add that, the killer doesn't get to offer his own explanation of why he did that. There's so much empathy, not empathy, but like trying to explain away, what his rationale could be, right? Oh, but he said he was having a bad day. Well, you know what? Like somebody's bad day shouldn't get 8 people killed. Like what the fuck, right? And then he gets to say like, oh, but by the way, I wasn't targeting Asians. So many people say that, but you saw us but you don't see us as friends, allies. You don't see us as full human beings. And so that's why it's easy for you to target us, because you don't see our humanity. And so that's one of the things that I'm starting to realize in all of this work. I see the clock counting down, and I will wrap up. But as I understand all of this stuff, I think like, oh, here are all the people who are organizing with us and standing with us. But here are all these other people who haven't stood up for us and who have not shown up for us. So we're not, like all of the solidarity is a two-way street, right? Like we need to show up for each other. Asians oftentimes have not shown up for other communities, but that's changing. But, I have a growing list of, oh, here are all the people who I'm gonna leave alone because they haven't said anything to me. They see what is happening in New York City and they haven't said anything. So I'm thinking like, nope, I'm crossing you off my list because, I can't trust you. All of this work, immigrant rights work, women's rights, all of this, it's about building community based on trust. And if you don't show up for each other, if we don't show up for each other in the time of need, when people are literally walking down the street and getting killed, I mean, what more is there to say?
I'll leave it there. Folks, please give a big hand applause for our panelists. Thank you so much for your time. There you go. And I guess we are going to come up with a couple of videos from two of our champions in Congress. I will leave it there. Thank you all so much for allowing me to be part of this, and have a great day.
Hello, everyone. I'm Senator Jackie Rosen, and I'm honored to address the National Immigration Integration Conference. I want to thank the National Partnership for New Americans for inviting me here to speak. Let me start by saying that I admire what the NPNA is doing to promote policies that support immigrant and refugee communities in the United States. And I'm proud of the organizations in your partnership, which continue to uphold the core American values of liberty, equality, and opportunity for all. Immigration and diversity have been essential to the development of the United States since its inception. Immigrants in this country, they're frontline workers, doctors and nurses, teachers and business owners. They're our neighbors, our friends, and our loved ones. And yet, immigrants and refugees face ongoing challenges. During my time as senator, I fought to keep families together at the border, for the humane treatment of refugees, and for the futures of DACA and TPS recipients in my home state of Nevada. I fought to protect DACA and TPS recipients and create a pathway to citizenship for immigrant workers. But there's more work to be done. The United States must address the inequities facing immigrant communities. We must fix our outdated immigration system to make it fair, orderly, and humane. We must address the disparities in healthcare, education, and economic opportunity that immigrants and communities of color face. And we must work to ensure that the United States is a welcoming country for refugees and asylum seekers. Together, we must fight to guarantee that everyone has access to the resources necessary to succeed. As a member of the Senate, I will support policies that foster growth, prosperity, and diversity within Nevada and across the entire country. Thank you, and I look forward to working alongside all of you as we continue the fight to protect immigrants and refugees in pursuit of equality and opportunity for all.
Hi, I'm Senator Alex Padilla, and I have the honor of representing California in the United States Senate. Thank you for inviting me to join you as you work to welcome and engage immigrants across our nation. In America, immigrants have always been essential. Immigrants have fought for our country in every major conflict since the Revolutionary War. Immigrants have created jobs, designed critical innovations, advocated for justice, and built strong communities. And for the last year and a half, immigrants have served on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic as doctors, nurses, teachers, farm workers, custodial staff, and workers in every essential industry. Immigrants have helped to see our country through one of its greatest challenges. No state is home to more immigrants than California. Our incredible diversity strengthens our communities. That's why I'm working in the U.S. Senate to reform our immigration system, to promote justice, to protect dignity, and to better reflect the needs of our country. As the proud son of immigrants, this mission is personal to me. Like so many others, my mom and dad came here to make a better life. They arrived in California from different parts of Mexico in the 1960s. They came with a belief in the promise of the American dream, that no matter where you're from, if you work hard, you can contribute to your community and build a better future for your family. My parents worked tirelessly for 40 years to realize that dream. My dad as a short order cook, and my mom as a housekeeper. And I remember watching them study hard for their naturalization tests And ultimately, after 30 years, they became United States citizens. I know firsthand the value that immigrants bring to our country. The National Partnership for New Americans affirms that value by highlighting the contributions and needs of our nation's immigrants. By working hard to increase equity and integration for immigrants, whether in education, health, refugee resettlement, or economic inclusion. I'm proud to support increased federal investments in immigrant integration programs that help provide these needed services. And I'm proud to partner with agencies throughout California as we coordinate resources for refugee resettlement and community building. As we work to build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic, we must fight to include justice for immigrants. We have a unique opportunity to use the budget reconciliation process to secure protections for millions of immigrants. And we have an obligation to the immigrants who have risked their own lives to work in essential roles. I'm committed to doing everything I can to deliver for our immigrant communities. Immigrants are the strength and the heart of the American story. I'm thankful for your partnership in this fight. Together, we will build our nation's next chapter.
Hello. Before you go off into your separate tracks and then eventually come back in here for lunch, we want to send you off with a beautiful vocal performance. Please give a big hand to musician Shweta Varma. Thank you.
Hello, hello, hello. Thank you. Runaka chunaka bhagavayala bhaji. Runaka chunaka bhaga sagamadani sa sani damagarisa. Runaka chunaka bhaga mama gamagarisa dani damagarisa. Runaka chunaka bhaga gamadani sani damapada magarisa. Runaka chunaka bhagavayala bhaji. Runaka chunaka bhaga gamadani sani ni sa sani da mama pada magaris. Runaka chunaka bhaga payala bhaji. Tumhari milan ko saga mama gamadada madani ni dani sa sa tumhari milan ko sani da magari sa sa gamadani sa tumhari milan ko dani sa magari sani dani da madani sa tumhari milan ko saga mama gamadada madani ni dani sa sa sani da magari sa sa gamadani sa dani sa magari sani dani da madani sa tumhari milan ko जियरा तरसी बैरी हो गई घर की लोगवा रूना का चूना का पगा रूना का चूना का पग रूना का चूना का पगा पायल बाजे Nadi di dani ta dani di ta na 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 nadi di dani ta dani di ta na 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 di ta na na ta na na no ta na 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 di ta na na ta na na no ta na 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 nadi di dani ta dani di ta na 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 nadi di dani ta dani di ta na 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 o di ta na di ta na 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 o di ta na di ta na 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 nadi di dani ta dani di ta na 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 nadi di dani ta dani di ta na 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 o di ta na di ta na 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 ta na na 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 ta na 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 o di ta di ta na 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 nadi di dani ta dani di ta na 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 nadi di dani ta dani di ta na 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 nadi di dani ta dani nadi di dani ta dani nadi di dani ta dani de Thank you, everyone. Thank you.